Hey guys, I got a brand new video for you today, and today we're looking at the new Canon 6D Mark II, and I got this on loaner from B&H for 30 days, so I'm gonna basically be making my review over the next month, but I decided to make an unboxing right now and kind of my first impressions and check out the dynamic range, because right now that's kind of a big topic on this camera. People were saying it had bad dynamic range before the camera was even out, so I wanna make sure that that's true and see what it can do. So first, let's get to the unboxing. So right off the bat, having this camera in my hand, I can definitely tell it's quite a bit lighter. It does have the flippy touchy screen, and compared to the old 6D Mark II, I would say it's quite a bit heavier. I don't know what they've done with this camera to make it lighter. Maybe it's more plastic, I'm not sure. But the older 6D is a little bit heavier. Looking at the top of the cameras, the only difference that's really changed on the 6D Mark II is there's now an autofocus select button right beside the shutter button. And on the old 6D, you don't have that. So the cool thing about the flippy touchscreen is you can actually access all the menus and control the menus from the touchscreen, which is something that isn't in every single camera that has a touchscreen. Right off the bat, I can tell the screen is quite a bit brighter, and we have the new autofocus system in this camera that's kind of taken over from the 80D. So it's got a 45-point cross-type autofocus system in it, and that's up from the 11 focus points on the old 6D with only one cross-type. And obviously there's a new sensor in this, 26 megapixel. That's up from 20 megapixel. And the camera obviously has no 4K video, but it shoots 1080p video up to 60 frames per second. It has dual pixel autofocus, and you can do touch to focus and tracking and stuff like that. I'm not sure I'm gonna try that out in this video, but I will show a little bit of sample of video shot with this camera. And one thing I got to try out, which is really cool, is the digital image stabilization. Now the Nikon D500 has that, and it really isn't that great. It's kind of jittery and not really smooth. This actually looks really natural and actually almost looks like in-body stabilization. And that's something that I never really heard too many people talk about. But if you vlog with this flip out screen and the digital image stabilization, I don't know, it might make a pretty good vlog camera. Anyway, that's all I'm gonna really talk about this camera. If you want to find out more specs, you can go on the website and check it out. But I want to get into some dynamic range tests, so I'm going to take some photos. I don't know if I'm going to do back-to-back with the old camera because, well, maybe I should. We'll just check out some recovery of highlights and shadows and see how well this camera holds up. Alright, so I have a bunch of shots here at ISO 100. A lot of them I underexposed on purpose just to see what we can do with shadow detail and highlight detail. Obviously, Canon cameras do a lot better when it comes to highlight detail versus shadow detail, especially compared to a lot of other cameras like Nikon, which do really well in the shadows. But I want to say thanks to Chiara for helping me out do some of these tests. Taking a look at the first image here, obviously underexposed. This was taken the 6D Mark II, 1/160th of a second, f2.8 ISO 100, and I would say I'm probably 1.5 to 2 stops under, so I'm gonna bump this up. And if we take a look at the shadows here, I'm gonna zoom in a little bit. You can see we get a bit of noise here, which is pretty intense compared to a lot of the cameras I've been using lately, especially at ISO 100. But if we pull these shadows out a little bit, obviously the detail's there, it's just a little bit grainy and noisy. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna copy these settings, Shift Control C, and paste them onto the 6D. I took the exact same shot with the exact same settings on the 6D. The only difference is I was a little bit crooked. If we paste these settings onto the 6D, you can see the noise levels here. But if we compare these two, 6D Mark II on the right, 6D on the left, we zoom in here, line these up a little better. You can see the noise levels in the shadows. I would say that the 6D Mark II is actually a little bit more grainier. But I would say the 6D Mark II has a little bit more detail. probably due to the fact that it's 26 megapixels versus 20 megapixels. but you definitely notice quite a bit of grain in the shadows. And I would even say, wow, I would even say the shadows are starting to take a little bit of a magenta cast, and this is at ISO 100. And you don't normally see this till you hit like ISO 800 or 1600 when you're really trying to boost the shadows. Again, I would never boost the shadows like this, but here's kind of a good spot right here where we can compare. It's definitely a lot more noisier. But again, this is underexposed. It's not a properly exposed image. So taking a look at another shot here, this is ISO 250. I bumped it up a little bit. This is again a little underexposed, more exposed for the sky. But if we go into develop here and drop the highlights back, you can see how much detail comes back out of these clouds. And if we pull the shadows out, it does a pretty good job of pulling the shadows out, but again, you're gonna notice that it's a little bit grainier. But the thing is, here we're dealing with ISO 250, so at ISO 250, it should be more grainy than ISO 100, and to be honest, I would say that it actually looks a little bit better, maybe because it's a little bit more properly exposed. But if I copy these settings, same shot with the 6D Mark I, and then we compare these two, 6D Mark II on the left, 6D Mark I on the right. Again, I would say there's a little bit more detail in the 6D Mark II. Obviously, the higher megapixel count, you see more detail in the eyes. Gotta go to the shadows though, down here. I would say that the grain is a little bit more obvious on the 6D Mark II. It's a little bit less sharpened on the 6D Mark I. I don't have any of the settings turned on for noise reduction and stuff like that in the raw settings, so they should be identical. The settings were exactly the same. I noticed that the 6D Mark I is kind of more truer to the real colors that I was looking at. There was more pink in the skies. The 6D Mark II has more of a green tone to it. 6D Mark I is more magenta and blue kind of. And I don't want to spend too much time on these shots because a lot of the time you're never going to underexpose this much. But I just thought I would touch on the subject since people are bringing it up. And it is a little obvious that at ISO 100 there is less detail. But let's go to ISO 400. This shot again is underexposed by a lot. And if we come up here and bump this up at least one time, maybe 1.5 stops, that's a little bit better. Obviously the background's overexposed now, but that's the best thing about these Canon cameras. You can pull the highlights back and all that sky detail comes back. Pull these shadows out a little bit, maybe drop the blacks a little bit. And I don't really like this pink color, but that's actually what it looked like outside. She has a little bit of paint on her arm. She works at a place where they design things that they need to paint, and she came right from work to help me out. Again, this is not a bad shot. ISO 400, we pulled the shadows out. This noise level looks kind of similar to what ISO 100 looks like. And plus, I was really underexposed. If we go back to what it looked like before, that's where we came from to where we are now. And that's not too bad. I would almost say the sweet spot for this camera probably is ISO 400. The shot here is 100 ISO. It's properly exposed. Shouldn't have a problem working with this stuff. Pull the highlights back a little bit. Bring the whites up. See, the noise levels are a lot better here because it was more properly exposed. So I do have a couple shots here that I took at ISO 6400 and they were properly exposed. When you take a look at the noise levels here, it's actually not that bad. It's pretty fine. Lots of detail still. So if you're properly exposing the images, you're not really going to have that much problems. Go in here and make a couple adjustments. I'd actually bring the shadows back. That looks pretty good. There's not too much noise, nice detail. And again, ISO 6400, I'm at the max shutter speed of this camera. I forgot to mention that this camera only does up to 1/4000th of a second, and it looks pretty clean. Anyway, from these test results, I would say the dynamic range isn't amazing at ISO 100. I've used crop sensor cameras that have way better dynamic range. So unfortunately, compared to the old 6D, it really isn't that much of an improvement, and it might even be worse, but in low light, it's pretty clean. A little bit cleaner than the 6D from what I can remember. Obviously didn't take too many shots at ISO 6400 on the 6D, but this kind of gives you a good example. And when I do my full review, we'll go over it a little bit more. All right, those are the results. Where does this camera kind of fall for me? I'm not really sure who this was made for, but it's kind of in a weird place and also weird for the price. It's definitely an entry-level full-frame camera, but I personally think this is only around a $1,600 camera, not $2,000. But once I get into my full review and put this thing to work, I'm gonna use it on some shoots, do some client jobs and stuff like that, and I'll really see how this thing works. I'm kind of making it a priority to use this exclusively, only this camera for the next month. So I'll have lots of stuff to share at the end of this month, and I'll go over a more detailed review. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you dislike this video, give it a thumbs down twice. I'll see you in the next one.